I'm excited for everyone who's joined us to discuss this topic of ancestral maps and the deeper meaning and messages they can provide to us as we navigate extreme states of being, such as voices and visions. Before we start, I just want to begin by acknowledging the land where I'm zooming in from, in the Connecticut River Valley. I want to acknowledge that I am living now in the ancestral homeland of both the Pecumtuck and the Nipmuc people. I want to honor the Pecumtuck and the Nipmuc as the traditional custodians of this land, Western Massachusetts, where I'm now from, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And this type of decolonization work is actually what we're going to be doing throughout the webinar, and I hope will continue as we go moving forward, providing space to reclaim ancestral languages, lifeways, and culture, and help heal people from the impact of colonization and things like Indian schools, where people have lost contact with these important spiritual tools and ways of making meaning. So if you want to learn more about beginning to do land acknowledgement, getting in touch with local tribal councils and getting to know the history and the frameworks, the wisdom of the ancestral indigenous people of your land, I really recommend the website nativelands.ca, a Canadian website. And ultimately, what brings us here is to all do this sort of rediscovering and uncovering work. Many of us, myself included, I'm not native to this land, but it also behooves me as a white person to learn, where do I come from? And what are the values and traditions of my culture beyond sort of the assimilationist or consumerist values that often we see in the general popular culture. So in that spirit, I am going to, part of my native culture is Jewish. That is the spiritual pathway that I follow. And in our tradition, traditionally in Jewish culture, learning together is a highly sacred act. It's a very holy act. So traditionally, one of the things that we might do when we come together in this way to learn together is to dedicate our learning to one or two of our ancestors. So I'm gonna engage in that ancestral practice right now and dedicate our learning today to two men who have been great examples for me in pathways of healing. They're Darren Drum, the founder of Toivo, and my father-in-law, Reverend Thomas Crawford Carlton. Both of these men were people that went through times of extreme suffering in their life, grappled with addiction, incarceration, and their pathway forward was reclaiming spiritual traditions for healing, Qigong, in the case of Darren Drum, and the Christian tradition, liberation theology, in the case of my father-in-law. And after they found their own healing, they took a lot of this work forward and worked in hospitals or created organizations where people who walked through extreme states of being could heal without being pathologized or medicalized but really be allowed to see themselves in a spiritual tradition. So I'll just say really briefly about myself. I'm going to be kind of talking about many of my own experiences throughout this webinar. So I'm not going to spend like a huge amount of time on my intro. I will say, you know, if you read my bio, I am studying to become a rabbi, and I have had the great benefit of having many teachers in different lineages, from Buddhist lamas to Christian nuns, doctoral researchers, and spiritual emergency have all been guides for me. But what I will say is most of my most important learning has really come from people who have navigated extreme states of being themselves. So I have learned a lot in the past over a decade of working in peer roles, in hospitals and community, in the public and private sectors of the mental health world. And I also want to say that for myself, when I'm talking about extreme states of being, these are also experiences that I have had, sensing energies, hearing things, seeing things others didn't. I've had these experiences throughout my life. And for a lot of years, those experiences were defined for me by the Western medical model. And I honestly struggled a lot with the world of diagnosis and pharmaceutical intervention. I've spent long periods in hospitals. But for me, my healing, my way out of the narrow place and being able to create a better relationship with my voices and visions began for me with reclaiming my ancestry. And I'll share, because a lot of times people are interested in this story, that path actually began by skating roller derby. So roller derby is an important subcultural sort of life way in and of itself that has its own initiation processes, like a lot of our ancestral traditions do, some that are quite physical in nature, but it's also very community based. So it's a very intense sport. And in playing roller derby, like in a lot of initiations, when you become ready to skate in real games with real hard hits, you are given a name, a new name, roller derby name. And so my roller derby name was given to me by a woman named Scariot Tubman, who also used roller derby to create this powerful ancestral identity connection with her African-American heritage. Her number was actually 40+1 for 40 acres and a mule. And she helped me create my roller derby name of Mazel Tov cocktail. So yes, that is a flaming bottle of kosher wine that you see there. But this identity and this reclaiming and rediscovering of a value system outside of the Western medical model is what allowed me to eventually move out of a group home. I was living in a staff psychiatric group home at the time. So it's been a huge part of my healing. So a lot of the ritual design that I now do as like a rabbinic student who helps hold sacred space in her community actually began with roller derby, because I remember one time I designed a roller derby practice for Passover that was like based on the story of like the Pharaoh and the 10 plagues. Anyway, if you want to know more about what that looked like, I'm in a book called Derby Lives, and if you're interested in reading more about roller derby and its role in my life, those resources are out there. But what I want to do now is really jump right into this notion of an ancestral map. This is something that I've been writing about, working with my voices and my ancestors that I both hear and see to sort of develop this language of ancestral map. And it's still a process, but the way that I'm defining ancestral map for the purposes of this webinar is as a framework for our experience that can provide us, number one, meaning. So one of my teachers, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi of blessed memory, one of the things he would often say is that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. Just like a plant seeks the light, we seek meaning. Unfortunately, for many of us, the meaning provided by DSM and a Seroquel prescription isn't sustaining enough. It doesn't help us really navigate the complexities of extreme state experiences. So an ancestral map can provide meaning. It can also provide connection. It takes us out of isolation. It connects us to people in the past. It unites us with this great story and also future ancestors too. And we were already talking about tools before the recording began. Ancestral maps, one of their powers is they offer us new paths forward, new ways to navigate an extreme experience, a painful experience, beyond just medicalized tools. So what's really exciting about an ancestral map is it both grounds us and roots us into something deep and old and sustaining. Our ancestors are holding us up. It provides that rootedness, but also when we're looking at a map, we're also engaging with that too. So an ancestral map view allows us to re-envision our story, to see ourselves in a new way, and we can reinterpret over and over again the ancestral maps provided to us by our traditions. So that's what I'm talking about when I refer to an ancestral map. And so what are some examples? There are many. So I've just listed a few from the Bhagavad Gita, you know, the story of Arjuna and Krishna on the battlefield, the Torah, which, you know, is the text of my people. So we'll be returning to that. I've spent a lot of time in Australia recently. An ancestral map used often there among Indigenous people is the idea of the dreaming or the dream time. These important stories about ancestors, animals, spirits that people can still connect to today. And certainly we can be inspired and create maps from the lives of our many saints, bodhisattvas, and prophets in various traditions. Also the tarot, I want to mention the tarot because you know, sometimes folks aren't really familiar with the structure and some of the uses of tarot. So particularly the major arcana, the cards of the tarot that have names like the Hermit or the Chariot. The major arcana of tarot actually represents a spiritual journey. And so many people use tarot to see themselves and their journey with their voices and visions or extreme states represented in a really powerful way. I also want to share, a lot of folks don't know that you know, in times in Spain, in a lot of areas of Europe, Jewish people had to go underground. So a lot of folks from that area might find out later in life that they have Jewish ancestry and roots. The tarot was used as a way to study Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, in secret. It made it look like you were playing cards, but you were actually looking at this incredible ancestral and powerful map of the Kabbalah. And so, you know, I don't really have the temperature of the room because we're a webinar. I don't know what different traditions people are from. But regardless, you have a rootedness, an ancestral birthright to the creation stories, the folk tales, the mythic narratives of your people, and can see yourself represented there. So what are the benefits of using an ancestral map framework for extreme states versus, say, a fundamentalist framework or a medicalized framework? One of the big benefits is an ancestral map acknowledges that there's not just this one consensus reality. So a lot of us as voice hearers struggle in this world where we're told our experiences aren't real or aren't valid because they're unshared. A lot of us as voice hearers struggle. Maybe you have the experiences I've had of hearing a voice that might have a quite dark perspective while at the same time hearing like a contrasting voice, and you're kind of like, huh, like, which is it? Like, which is the truth? But for a lot of us, our ancestors did not buy into this modern idea of one truth determined by the scientific method. So in Torah, for example, if you look at Torah, the origin stories, the creation of the world, in the book called Bereshit in Hebrew, also called Genesis, you see literally two creation stories side by side, one right after the other, and they're both slightly different from one another, but the text never goes and explains or says this is the right one and this one you know, is an unproven hypothesis. They literally exist side by side. And so our ancestors are often telling us this idea that reality is multiple. There are always more than one way to view something, and it's not that one is any less true. In the words of Sherry Mead of Intentional Peer Support, we have multiple truths, and that can be a great comfort as we're supporting people, especially if our realities are different. It doesn't mean that one is any less true. Ancestral map framework is also very different than a fundamentalist view of sacred text. Our ancestral maps are distinct from any particular religious institution or power structure. So sometimes there's this divide of like, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. But being spiritual means that you don't get to hold on to some of your ancestral traditions, texts, or tools. With ancestral maps, we can have both. We can have both. We can take our traditions, we can take these stories and have an intimate relationship with them that is distinct from a power structure. We can also create communities, like in the Jewish Chavurah movement, where we come together communally to do ritual work or ceremony, but have that be independent of an institution. And also in an ancestral map, we would not cherry pick from texts to reinforce oppressive power systems. So since it is National Coming Out Day, like I'll say, for example, we often see people taking a brief part of Hebrew text, taking it out of context, and mistranslating the text to say that homosexuality is a sin. And that's not accurate to what our ancestral map actually says. And in fact, you know, there's many stories particularly in the Hebrew tradition, but other ancestral traditions that embrace same-sex love as profound and important, you know, such as the story of David and Jonathan, the story of Ruth and Naomi. My wedding ring actually says, Ki el asher telchi elech, wherever you go, I will go. And those are words that a woman spoke to a woman. We have very powerful ancestral examples that we can look to that embrace gender non-conforming people and love that is not just between a man and a woman. So ancestral maps acknowledge this. And so an ancestral map is both used to personally empower us with our connection to our ancestors, but also it grounds us to a community too. We're not isolated. So let's look at an example really quickly of how we might use an ancestral map. I'm just gonna jump right in there to actually a story that a lot of people struggle with. And I like that because I'm someone who in my life, a lot of people have struggled with me. I've been placed in like jails before and locked units. I've had some extreme states of being. So we're not gonna shy away here from some of the intensity because I think in the end that kind of harms us. So I'm gonna look at an ancestral map here, the story of Abraham. And what I love about Abraham is he is also considered holy in, you know, we have the Abrahamic traditions, right? So Abraham also includes Christianity and Islam with Ibrahim. And so we have this famous story of Abraham. If it's okay, I'm gonna use the Hebrew pronunciation since that's my lineage. And where Abraham is hearing a voice that he perceives as divine. And this voice is telling him to sacrifice his son. And so you can see the image of that below. And Abraham goes, he goes to a mountain, prepares to do this act in a very literal way. But then the story shifts and there's a vision, a voice, a holy being appears to Abraham and says, no, I'm not saying you're a bad person, Abraham, you're loved by God and like chosen by God, but this isn't exactly what I want you to do. I actually want you to sacrifice this ram over here instead. And then what subsequently happens is this sacrifice is not in the literal sense, but Abraham, you know, goes out and creates this lineage of ancestry that goes from himself to his sons, Yitzchak in the Hebrew tradition, and Yishmael in Islam. So here we have this really intense story that I think people have struggled with a lot. But I love this story because I think it's a powerful ancestral map for us as voice hearers. So I see myself a lot in this story because I've heard voices that have told me to kill myself or hurt other people. That is part of my experience. This ancestral map tells me I'm not alone. Others have had this experience. But this ancestral map also gives me this really powerful example that I do not have to take those voices and visions in the literal sense. I can perceive them as divine Certainly. But that means that they might have a deeper spiritual meaning than what is on the surface. And so with this ancestral map, it really provides a framework for a lot of the work I've done supporting people with extreme states, which is normalizing it, sanctifying it in some ways, saying that this is valuable, that we have this state, it's meaningful, but let's work together to discover what the message might be beyond, just the words that we're hearing. Does it mean that we need to kill a part of ourselves, that a part of ourselves might need to die? If we're asked to sacrifice something, what does that really look like? Does it mean we have to get rid of it completely, or could we rededicate it in some way? Another important piece of ancestral maps is, as Jews, we actually read this story. It's called the Akedah, the Binding of Isaac, every single year on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And the reason is we are called to interpret and reinterpret this map over and over again. So what I love is our traditions tell us that we're going to learn more information. Life is like a spiral. So a voice or a vision that I'm seeing right now, I might attach one meaning, but with more information and with more time, it actually is a holy act for me to look at other interpretations of what that experience means. And so, you would see this in Judaism, like in the Talmud, where people are interpreting and reinterpreting these ancestral maps. And we can do it with our voices and visions too. Another final piece about ancestral maps is they connect us to a shared value system that is outside some of the value systems we see in this country, such as white supremacy, consumerism, ableism. So there's this great Zadig, a holy man in my tradition, and his name is Bob Dylan. Robert Zimmerman was his actual name. Maybe you've heard some of his songs, but he has a song that essentially says, you are going to serve somebody. It may be the devil and it may be the Lord, but you are going to serve somebody. And the way I interpret his teaching there is, if I assimilate or throw away my ancestral teachings, instead of wrestling with them, if I just discard them, what that leaves me with is this huge cultural vacuum of values. And into a vacuum, something is going to step in. So in our country, a lot of times, if we're not indigenous and didn't experience genocide, but maybe we came here as immigrants and were expected to assimilate and get rid of our cultural traditions, that left us very vulnerable to value things like whiteness, or famously money. A lot of our ancestral maps warn us against this idea of putting money over justice and love. In fact, I can't really think of a tradition that doesn't have messages and teachings about that. The suffering, for example, that can be caused by greed and grasping. So when we abandon our traditions or our force, because for many of us, we are force, these other value systems take root. And another big example is the Western medical model of biochemical illness too. So if we've lost a lot of our spiritual and cultural worldviews for madness or extreme states, we're kind of left hanging without a lot of tools and a lot of meaning. And I know in my life, sort of, you know, the whole medication thing became paramount. The language, you know, my experiences, instead of being called spiritual experiences, were called psychotic. And if we call something psychotic, usually, you know, it's almost like a magic spell. What we call something dictates what we do with it. So I was often placed on these heavy sort of anti-psychotics. So hopefully people are getting a sense here of what we mean by ancestral map, and also taking some time to sort of reflect on themselves and for the people that you're supporting, what some of those maps, stories may be, and the traditions that they are connected to and the tools. So my friend Jeannie, I don't know if Jeannie is on here right now. She's someone I love to talk to about these types of ideas. She shared about this webinar on Facebook, and someone wrote a really great question underneath, which is, because in the description, I was talking about being in open dialogue with our ancestors. Probably everyone on this call is familiar with the open dialogue approach, which really looks at human distress as occurring in the spaces between people, and talking about this exchange of ideas and a network of support being what helps folks move through an extreme state. So probably everyone's familiar. If you're not, I'm sure there's webinars available to learn more about open dialogue approach. But what does open dialogue with our ancestors mean? So someone had written on Jeannie's Facebook, you know, what does that mean? Is that like when you use like an empty chair? Referring to voice dialogue approach as developed by Hal and Sidra Stone, where a facilitator would talk to, let's say, my voice of Shakina that I hear. We would open a chair for her, and I would just kind of allow her voice to speak through me, and someone would engage with that voice. And certainly that can be a really powerful tool. If you're not familiar with voice dialogue, Rufus May and Elizabeth Svalnhomer have recently put out some great some great videos on their website, openmindedonline.org. So that is one way, but there's also many, many others. And so on the slide here, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not. So I'm just gonna kind of go from left to right. First we have an altar in a home used in, this is from the Yoruba tradition, where someone can engage with their ancestors, leave them offerings and get their support. Also, it can involve ancestral healing too, because I've heard voices of my ancestors that were not always nice. In fact, I'm working on healing a relationship with a voice I identify as my great-grandfather. And so that type of exchange and healing and dialogue is important. And we can do this by creating sort of a physical space in our home. But also we have an example of a Shinto shrine. Ancestral dialogue is very important in that worldview, and they have certainly spaces dedicated to us. We also have examples. The rocks are often called grandfathers. Maybe you are familiar with the ceremony and practice of a sweat lodge. This is a way to be in communication with ancestors. The rocks are heated, and then water would be placed on the rocks so that our ancestors can emerge and we can engage with them that way. Also engaging with trees. So the example on the slide is a baobab tree. Going out into nature, for many of our ancestors, you know, they would communicate spiritually through trees, and they could continue that dialogue. And then, because this is ISPS, I'm sure everyone is familiar with Jung. Answer to Job is certainly not one of Jung's most famous works, but it's a great example of someone being in open dialogue with their ancestors through writing, and engaging with this story of Job and his suffering. And sometimes I've seen and been a part of like healing circles where people take an ancestral map, like the story of Job or Jonah. I was just part of a circle on Yom Kippur where people spoke from the voice of Jonah. So like Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale, the rabbi was like, I want you to tell me how you feel, but I want you to say I from the place of you are Jonah. And so people were saying, I'm scared, or I'm a failure, or I don't know what to expect. And doing this is actually a really healing way to get emotions out without having to personally identify our experiences. So a lot of trauma survivors are uncomfortable with sharing their own experience. They've been told, you know, if you tell that I abused you, you'll be punished forever. There's a lot of fear. But what people have found is if we can get those expressions out by maybe pretending we are Job or Jonah and speaking from their place, it offers us a similar benefit. Another important message, I think, from Ancestral Maps is that our experiences, you know, are messengers, voices, and visionary states. And we shouldn't make the mistake that the Western medical model does of defining the voices and the visions themselves as the problem, and essentially shooting the messenger, saying like, you're the bad manifestation, instead of the actual phenomenon the voice is trying to communicate to us about. So many of our ancestors understood this, that we wouldn't shoot the messenger, that we wouldn't define the voice itself as bad. So an example, I wanted to represent the Celtic tradition because it is a part of my ancestry too. A lot of Celts speak to hearing the voice of kind of this screaming woman, and that can be very disturbing. In the Celtic tradition, though, hearing the voice of a screaming woman does not mean that you are mentally ill. It means that you're receiving a message of change. So the story of the Banshee is, you know, that they are messengers of death. But remember, when we're looking at ancestral maps, that death isn't always a literal death. It can be, you know, transformation or change. So we wouldn't want to define ourselves as bad or our messenger as bad. It's just information that we can use. And a lot of these states that we go into, another mistake is seeing them as really permanent. So we have the example here of Jacob wrestling with the angel, this very intense episode from Hebrew texts where he wrestles all night with an angel, and at the end of it is transformed and receives a new name. And this idea of going through an intense night of transformation. Now, a lot of times in our lives, it's not a literal one night, though it can be. It might be a period of months or years where we wrestle with our voices, but we have so many ancestral maps for the value of that and examples of people who come out on the other side of that. So whether that's Yaakov or Yisrael in the picture below, in the Christian tradition, there's St. John of the Cross, who speaks of the dark night of the soul. Also Muhammad's very intense night journey. We can all look at these. Many cultures have initiation processes that are intense. And again, we don't look at these things as a bad pathology or lifelong. So I was told in the mental health system that I had a lifelong mental illness. I don't believe that was culturally confident, though it doesn't make sense for me. But yeah, that was what I was told. So what we're gonna do now, and I wanna be honest that I'm not really able to follow the chat box at the same time. I hear voices pretty much all day long, so for me it's kind of hard to like navigate multiple realities that include the chat box. So what I'm gonna check in with Ron shortly about what's going on in there. But before I do, I just want to hit on what I anticipate, because they've been so common in my work, what I anticipate being some of the biggest things that folks have questions around in terms of extreme states. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is navigating chosenness, initiation, or awakening. So probably everyone has met someone, for example, that's gone through this extreme state and has discovered that they are Jesus Christ, for example, or they've been chosen by God in some way. This is very, very common. This is also an experience that I've had in a different way. I've also supported people that were having visions of powerful totem animals that wanted to consume them, which is indicative of an awakening or initiation in many indigenous traditions. So these states happen. And so what are some of the important questions that we need to ask as supporters, or if we're going through them ourselves, to navigate them? So the first piece is really defining, what is my role? Like, what am I being chosen to do? So if I'm, hearing a voice that's telling me I'm Jesus Christ, what does that mean? Or the angel Gabriel, who were these people? What were some of their value systems? What changes might I make in my life? I remember one time hearing a voice, a very loud voice. It was a spiritual experience in a synagogue. And this voice was telling me, go pick up that scroll and run with it, child. Run with it, child. Take your shoes off and run with it right out into the woods. Go. And it was really intense. It was loud. And it was one of those moments of sort of like I'm being reached out to by this force. And I could have in that moment done exactly what the voice said, but it probably wouldn't have gone well, because it was referring to a Torah scroll, and people would probably have been upset if I'd gone up there and grabbed it and ran out in the woods without my shoes. So what was important for me, and also for folks that I support, is, what does this mean? What does it mean to pick up something and run with it? Does that mean to make teachings your own? What does it mean to take off your shoes? Is it to be grounded or closer, make things earth-based? And so a lot of conversations with support are, what is the role? You know, for example, if someone is hearing a voice that's telling them that they can fly, what does that look like? Are you now a messenger like eagle in many traditions, like between the worlds? So figuring out the role, looking deeper. Also, the next two questions, who are my supporters and how is this sustainable? So once you've defined the role that you're being called, initiated or awakened, to figuring out who's in this with you, who shares these values, and who can be a guide. This isn't always easy to do, especially in our assimilated culture, but it's definitely important to look into so that people aren't holding this all alone. And related to supporters is, how is this sustainable? So if I am in this awakened or chosen state, what do I need to do to keep going? And so that's where a lot of our ritual practices become involved, such as meditation, prayer, taking time out in nature, maybe changing our diet. There's a lot of different ways that people figure out that we work to create a sustainable state. Also acknowledging, as we said before, that these states can be temporary. Now I just want to point people out. I chose these images very intentionally for this slide. These are women, chosen, awoken, initiated women in the traditions of Islam, Christianity, and the Hebrew tradition. I chose them. They are Rabia of Basra, that's Rabia on the left there, Mary Magdalene in the middle, and the wife of Manoach on the side. And I intentionally chose them because they push back on sort of like stereotypes of divine femininity. These are strong, unconventional women. Rabia, you know, there's stories that Rabia lived in a brothel. She was one of the great Islamic saints, and she would often do intense stuff like run through the streets. That's a picture of her running through the streets, using water and fire to sort of like metaphorically wash away sin, I think is how she identified it. So she was like an intense, powerful woman. Similarly, Mary Magdalene, we know, had a very unconventional, well, not stereotypical path for a holy woman. And the wife of Manoach is also very too like an empowered woman who the angel literally says, you dictate to your husband what God wants. So I just, you know, sometimes there's this critique that people have that you can't be a feminist Muslim or Jew or Christian, and that's categorically false. We have many ancestral maps of very powerful, holy women in our traditions to draw from. So that's who's featured on the slide. Now, the second piece I want to get into here, we've talked about awakening and some of the things to consider. I want to touch on possession states because I think that's one of like the second most common that I've supported people navigating possession by some sort of entity. In this framework, let's just remember that identifying a possession state, we should allow the individual to define that and determine that. So this is not, you know, what we've seen in the past of like telling people, oh, you're possessed by a demon. We really have, you know, no way of knowing that. We should be grounded in the story of the person we support. And if this is how they identify their experience, then we should support them with it, even if it's a different worldview. Remember, we've talked about multiple realities and spiritual frameworks. So we want to honor their experience. And I do want to say that for a lot of people that identify with possession, they feel a lot more empowered in their experience than do some folks that identify with brain or genetic abnormalities. So the biomarkers that were popularized kind of in last century as explanations for why people struggle, I've seen leave a lot of folks disempowered, and you know, possession states from a jinn or a demon or a spirit provide people with actually a lot more tools, and you know, they can be used. A lot of these tools are compatible with other healing modalities such as neurofeedback, internal family systems. So we're going to talk about learning to live with our demons or spirits. IFS is famous for doing some of that work. Acupuncture, ghost points, and acupuncture to release energy can be a really powerful modality. Another shout out to Jeannie Bass, emotional freedom technique is one we've talked about before. It operates around energy meridians, tapping, it's sometimes called, and it can move energy through us and is totally compatible with ideas of possession. And another important thing that I want to add about possession is to say that, you know, demons, for example, like jinn or, sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. The word I'm about to say kind of sounds like a sneeze, shadim, which is demons in Hebrew. It's a gross oversimplification in many cultures that demons are purely evil. In my own culture, demons exist in Judaism, but they are not from Satan. They're just separate from God. And so the way that you engage with demons in Jewish folk magic is to kind of send them back to the wilderness where they live and where they belong and have purpose. So let's talk about tools, because people were wanting a breakdown of tools. And, you know, one of the wonderful things about spiritual and cultural framework is the tools are kind of endless. We have so many tools at our disposal. Now, when I'm supporting someone, it can be easier, one, if they have particular traditions that they identify with, but to break things down a bit and make it more simple. So I've broken things down to sacred space, sacred materials, sacred sounds or words, sacred time, or sacred energy. And we can explore, kind of go down the list and look at what are some of these things and how can they be used to empower. So what are some of the holy sites or spaces? Maybe they're in nature, maybe it's a place where relics of a saint are held. Where is there a space I can go? A place perhaps where many people have prayed or meditated, where I can tap into the energy of that space to support me. Materials, physical materials can be very empowering and helpful for people. So in Islam, the jinn are averse to iron. So if someone has that, you know, framework for their possession state, objects made of iron can feel very comforting and empowering. Salt in many traditions sort of repels spirits. We certainly have traditions of blessed water, either water blessed by a holy person or water from a sacred river, like the Ganges, or you know, I was hanging out with a Lakota elder on Yom Kippur who brought sacred water from his land. And certainly woods and herbs. Most people are familiar with smudging, incense, Palo Santo, lighting of candles. All of these things can be really helpful for folks navigating what they identify as possession or many states beyond that. Sacred words and sounds and song. So in Judaism, we have a lot of these. Sometimes like it is just a wordless melody, like you know, what's called a nigun. That's one traditional for Friday nights that can provide centering and healing, the sense of an extra soul. We also have the psalm, the prayer of last resort, the Anabakoach, which I'll show you an image of a medallion later. But certainly people have used, you know, sacred songs and recited the words of the psalmist to support them. Words of the Quran, you know, Muslim people speak words of Quran 5 times a day in connection with God, and these words can be tremendously healing. Also, it's important to think about sacred time. So lunar cycles, we're coming up on a couple important holidays. Sukkot in the Jewish tradition is a time of communing with the ancestors. Also Samhain is coming up at the end of the month, a time where, you know, indigenous European cultures speak about the veil being thin. So these times, there are certain times where our work, our spiritual healing work or depossession has more juice. So when we're supporting people, thinking about what are some of those times. And then certainly there's sacred energies. So in a lot of cultures, when we experience a trauma, a part of our soul flies off. And we can visit a healer to help retrieve the soul, working with the chakras, doing yoga, kundalini, and certainly the breath. The breath is very important, breathing technique. So a lot of folks, you know, we're ISPS, so I think psychosis is one of those words. Many people know that psychosis comes from the Greek root psyche, which can be translated as soul, but also it is translated as breath. So our ancestors have always known that working with breath is incredibly important, either if we're dealing with difficult entities in a possession state or other types of energies. So this is a breakdown that I like to use when working with folks because it keeps things simple. And we can look at these pieces, but also, you know, we can combine pieces of these to create ritual and ceremony. So I'm going to include some examples. Actually that piece, that metal amulet that you see down there is a very basic you know, use of sacred words as a protection. So that's the Anabakoach on an amulet. And so for a lot of folks, having something that they can wear, something that they can keep on their person to protect them. Maybe it's a medicine bag, exploring that, that they can hold on to when things get intense is key. And I've included some examples of rituals that I have designed for certain healing purposes that combine, you know, these elements, these separate elements of sacred time, sacred words, also ancestral maps. So that is a sword that you see above that menorah. There's an ancestral map for that. There's a story of a woman named Yehudit associated with Hanukkah, a very powerful woman that uses a sword. So that's an image from my house where we designed a ritual. This was during the time of like Brett Kavanaugh's, you know, being placed on the Supreme Court. And we really needed a sacred ritual to reclaim sort of feminine power and strength. I know some of my voices were really activated, some of my trauma memories. So we created a ritual using a sword, and every candle that was lit on that menorah, someone lit in honor of a powerful female figure. So a candle was lit for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who 2 days later actually came out as having Jewish ancestry. Also Leslie Feinberg, other powerful women. So that was a healing ritual to get folks to move through trauma and also pain and rage. The other image is a ritual designed for Tisha B'Av, which is a time in the Hebrew calendar for grieving intense losses. So we all sat on the floor, chanted, wept together. People named things that they were grieving. And then the keys come from a midrash, a Jewish story where at the time of this destruction of this temple, someone threw keys in the air and they were caught by the Shekhinah, the divine feminine. So we kind of juiced up the keys during the ritual, and then people could take the keys as a reminder of what grief can unlock for them. And they could keep that with them, you know, as they were going through grief, to have something physical that was ritually sort of charged to hold on to. I know I need to take questions soon, and so it's gonna come right after this slide. I've seen the questions coming through the chat box. The last thing that I want to say before we go to questions is around this idea of working with demons. So we've already said that for a lot of us, it's not really culturally competent to identify negative entities as purely evil. That's not, you know, things are much more complicated than that in most of our ancestral cultures. Now, the other stories I want to share are, a lot of times the way that we work with negative entities is through embracing them and getting to know and understand them. So the Ancestral Maps I'll offer is a wonderful story of the Buddha, where you know, the Buddha is hanging out in a cave with his disciples, and the demon Mara shows up. So if you know the story of the Buddha, Mara kind of tortured Buddha underneath the Bodhi tree before he woke up. Mara is this really intense force of sort of like temptation. But Mara shows up, and you know, the monks want to shoo him away, but the Buddha invites Mara inside, and they have a cup of tea together. And Mara's like, you know, Buddha, like, it's really not easy to be a demon, and kind of shares you know, their story with the Buddha, and the Buddha is like, well, it's not easy to be a Buddha. And they kind of, yeah, they have a cup of tea together. And so for a lot of folks like myself, for whom, you know, my voices aren't going away. There is not like a substance that I have found that will make them go away. So what we need to do is kind of develop this relationship of understanding. Sometimes with my difficult voices, it's asking them like, what are you afraid of? Or who has hurt you? And offering them some compassion. And so more and more this idea of compassion for voices or demons or entities is taking hold in kind of the mental health world. And there's a lot of great resources out there to explore that. The other image, I took that picture myself of, it's the goddess Varahi. So the Hindu tradition is absolutely an incredible, rich tapestry of ancestral maps. This Varahi is one of the 7 mothers of an extremely powerful goddess. And these images of sort of powerful goddesses can be really healing for women that have been trauma survivors or told that they can't feel anger or be in touch with their rage. There's actually many ancestral maps of powerful, holy, raging, feminine deities, and Varahi is one. Varahi also, very famously, there's a story, I think, with the demon Andakasura, where she's sent to kind of vanquish this demon, and she ends up drinking the demon's blood. And I think it's another really powerful ancestral map of sometimes we do, consume things that are difficult, but sometimes the things that are most challenging in our lives can also sustain us, and can also provide us kind of nourishment. So like this idea of that which is destructive and creative can be in one place at the same time. So our ancestral maps allow us to strike new relationships with extreme states, and learn from them. So I realize I've been talking a lot. Thank you for listening, because I'm really passionate about this topic. I want to pause now to see if there's a couple questions that people had, and I'll need Ron's help with that.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. It's been great hearing you talk, and look forward to hearing you answer some questions too. So people feel free to type in your question now. I know a few people have already typed some things in. Marin says that I recognize many sources of ancestry, including a genetic ancestor who's Cherokee. How does everyone honor ancestors and our intuitive sense to be in relationship with them, and while also coping with accusations maybe of cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And, I think going to elders and learning more is always an incredible thing. So when I've heard people talk about cultural appropriation, which is such an important topic, a lot of it comes from when people want to capitalize or make money off of something or divorce it from its original intention. And these are really important things. And I have critiques of folks, for example, that might say, oh, we should all be mindful, but we shouldn't learn more about like the social justice teachings of like, these traditions that gave us mindfulness. So I have never had a bad experience when I've reached out to a member of a tradition and said, I would love if you are willing to learn more, to have an exchange about, what your ancestry means to you. I mentioned how this Yom Kippur, we were visited by a Lakota elder, and I loved what he did. I want to share this story. He was offering a prayer for the earth at a point during the Yom Kippur service. But before he put the kippah, the yarmulke, the traditional Jewish prayer head covering, before he put that on his head, he walked up to a young Jewish man in the audience, and he said, or not audience, but like in the prayer circle, and said, "What does it mean to you that I would put this on my head? What does this mean?" because I want to understand it. And the young man said to him, to me, it means presence. And the Lakota elder said, thank you. Thank you for teaching me. And only then did he place the kippah on his head. So I think it's a very complex topic, but I just wanted to share an ancestral map, if you will, like a story that kind of encapsulates some of that sort of humility and exploration of like traditions that we might not be close to or exactly our own.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So Stephen's asking, what can be a map for someone both hurt by spiritual traditions and someone who finds little positive meaning in them?
Yeah, so ultimately, you know, there's a lot of profound, like some of these stories, I think what some people get uncomfortable with is maybe being expected to believe something that they don't believe. But what I'll offer for myself, you know, as a Jew, for example, I can look at the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua, and find a lot of great stuff in there. A lot of great sort of anti-capitalist, social justice, heart-centered wisdom. And certainly, you know, he was a Jew too, he was a rabbi. I can look to all of that, but I don't necessarily, to take those teachings, I don't need to buy into any Christian theology to learn from that map. It can be sort of like this exploration. And for a lot of our practices, you know, it might just be things that we do, and we don't necessarily have to believe. For example, we don't have to believe we're praying to something outside of us to engage in depth in breath work or read sacred texts. Like I have a poem from Rumi that we might get to later. There's a lot of folks that find a lot of wisdom in the words of Rumi, without necessarily believing, as Rumi would have done, in Allah, in like a one God. So what I'll say is there's a lot out there to explore. And because we're using these as ancestral maps, we're not beholden to kind of like, you know, buy into a particular system to find healing and meaning.
Yeah, I like the way you emphasize exploration and looking for possibilities and not, you know, rather than just being locked into something. So Robin's asking, is the power or efficacy different using an ancestral map from your own ancestry versus that of from others?
So I think that's a really individual question. And ultimately, I would love to know, like for each person here that maybe begins to explore this concept, what they find. Because, you know, as I've been doing this webinar, you can probably tell, like I have a particular tradition. I am Jewish. I am a member of synagogue. I, you know, lead Jewish prayer spaces. But I've also gotten a lot of sort of like energy and inspiration from, as I was talking about, the goddess Varahi, who's on our screen still, and the Buddha's engagement with Mara. So I think it's going to depend, but what I'll say is this, community matters. Communal ritual is powerful. So if you've got a space where you can come together with people and sort of, you know, in Judaism, there's literally certain rituals we can't do unless you have 10 people, because we acknowledge the importance of community. There's many ceremonies. So I guess there's that piece where, you know, to give some of these practices real juice and meaning, you're going to want communal support. And, you know, that might be harder to do in some traditions than others. But ultimately, you know, I think it can be pretty individual. But I love the question.
Just to play off that a little bit, Robin wonders how you recommend finding supportive communities for rituals like the one you mentioned, like if someone doesn't have that immediately available.
Yeah. So for me, like do you identify, can I ask Robin if you identify with a particular tradition?
So let's see. Probably you can go ahead and type something in. Yeah, so Robin says, my background is Jewish, but I've been part of a Christian church for 25 years.
Okay. So yeah, then for you, what I would recommend these ritual design is really inspired by both the Jewish renewal movement and also the work of the Kohenot, the work of Rabbi Jill Hammer. There are certain websites you can go to connect with folks that are exploring earth-based and feminist Jewish practice. And if you email me, and I'm going to put my contact up, I will send you links. I can also send you links. A lot of teaching is done over webinar these days, as we're doing right now. So you can connect with people that are doing like Jewish ancestral healing and reclaiming of traditions online.
Yeah. And Robin's also mentioning that her church has been personally supportive, but can be uncertain about experiences with voices. So I think that's maybe one thing is sometimes people's, what might be a supportive community gets kind of freaked out by people's actual experiences.
And that's real. And that is why I think more of these conversations need to happen. So I'm doing a lot of writing about ancestral maps, but it's not just us that needs to be having this discussion. It's spiritual leaders. And so what I've done is talk at synagogues about my experiences hearing voices, given like talks to help shift those attitudes, but that can be slow. So I do recommend also, you know, finding Hearing Voices Network groups in your area. You can go to hearingvoicesusa.org. I'm on the board of that organization. And so if there's not a group in your community, I can connect you to online groups. I think the Stephen in the chat box is one of my co-facilitators for an online HBN group. And these groups are places where, you know, you can talk about your voices and your spiritual frameworks. All HBN facilitators are trained to honor the validity of spiritual and cultural worldviews for voices and come from a place of curiosity and acceptance, and not, you know, privilege, certainly not privilege the medical model over these important ancestral maps for voices.
Yeah. So Catherine says, I found significant improvement with my relationship with my mental illness with somatic experiencing therapy. I usually describe it to others as being body-based mindfulness. What kind of traditions contain body-based therapies?
So ultimately, a lot of our traditions, if you go back far enough, see the body as holy and as a vessel. So in a lot of traditions, there's not this separate language for mental health. There's also not this idea that the soul or the sacred is something separate from the body. So I'm really glad that people are working on embodied practices for engaging with their spiritual experiences or voices and visions. So really all of our traditions, if you go back far enough, like I said, in Greek, the language of the Christian Gospels was Greek. In Greek, this word psyche that's used for soul, it also means breath. So for people that are like, oh, I'm a Christian, can I do embodied breathwork practices? Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a part of your ancestral connection. Certainly in Judaism, but many worldviews, you tap into the chakra system, for example, by moving the body. In Chinese medicine, there's meridians in the body. So I love the question. It's a big one, but I think for the purposes of this webinar, if what we've taken from this is that spiritual exploration also involves the body and the breath, then I think that's a real win. And that's undoing sort of this mythology that the spirit or the soul is really separate from our body, and that our bodies aren't sacred. They are, and our traditions teach us that.
Yeah. And Andrea commented that singing the Psalms regularly in a Benedictine monastery was at one point really necessary and made a fundamental change to leave behind like critical, up-to-date mind thinking about the text and its strange implications, and just give in and sing the words, maybe because it's done by thousands of people for thousands of years, and it opened up a whole new world of experiences.
Beautiful. And a recommendation I have for folks that want to try that practice, there's a Rabbi Chef of Gold. So for a lot of folks, the translations of the Psalms into English are rough, and they're not that good. So some people find the power of chanting them in the original Hebrew to be helpful. I forgot to even mention kirtan in this talk, which is such an important sacred word practice. But chanting, there's a great website, Rabbi Chef of Gold, who writes, you can find Psalms in Hebrew that have beautiful chant melodies that you can use in your practice. And more people are creating chant circles where they can come together and get that juice that you talk about of communally chanting these sacred words.
Yeah. So Patrick's mentioning that finding it helpful once to hear a conservative fundamentalist Christian pastor explain that voices could be Satan disguising himself as God, and found that helpful in separating helpful voices from non-helpful. But I know also, Carolyn, in your example, you talked about with Abraham, how sort of like getting a voice that seemed to be God, and maybe if it was taken literally, it would have led to something bad. But then by kind of like wrestling with it a bit, it actually came out to be something good. So some things are have more nuance, but it's quite complex. I don't know what you want to say about that.
Well, what I'll say is I'll just come back to our ancestral map, like our ability to interpret and reinterpret experience. That is what our ancestors have done for millennia. They have looked for deeper meaning, and we've been allowed to change and evolve our understanding So in this framework, like if your framework, if that is what empowers you in your relationship to your experience, if that's what's connects you and feels healing, then by all means, I want to honor the validity of your interpretation. That is what's important. And we have the space, you know, to cycle through. We're not going to get to everything, but I'll just share this one last slide of understanding impermanence. It's such a huge piece of our spiritual frameworks. And we have the Buddha, Kundalini awakening, but also just the cycles of the moon and the seasons. In New England, where I live, the earth looks really different in the winter than it does in the summer. That's natural, and that's holy. We cycle and we change. We go inward and outward, and all of that change and impermanence is totally cool in the views of our ancestors and what's needed to learn and grow.
Yeah. So what you said about interpreting and reinterpreting, I think is so essential. I also know sometimes we will get caught up in a fear of making an interpretation other than the literal. I mean, I've seen that in fundamentalism, but I've also seen it as somebody who's just getting a command from a voice that says it's God. And to question that is sort of like, feels like it's defying God. And yet, what like you say, it's so crucial. So I don't know if you have anything about how to help people enter that space where they can consider different interpretations.
Yeah, totally. If you're worried, you know, particularly, you know, if you're in a Christian framework about, you know, not taking things literally, what I would urge you to do, like, is look to Jesus, for example, that often used parables and metaphors to convey deeper lessons. The Gospels are full of these stories. So certainly we have a rich tradition of these messengers. You know, is in the story of the mustard seed, is it really about a mustard seed? No. So don't feel that you're somehow betraying the roots of your spiritual tradition by doing that, because the texts and the teachings are just rich in metaphor.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we've kind of used the time schedule for the webinar. It seems like I don't know, Carolyn, if you have to run or if you want to hang out for a little bit and answer a few more questions if they pop up, or.
Yeah, I have to facilitate an alternatives to suicide group in a little bit, but I can stay for a few more minutes if people have other questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Robin just mentions, in my experience, the work of interpreting is part of the personal growth God is aiming at. So definitely if you have that kind of perspective, you'll be willing to do that work.
Yeah. And I'll say, like, in my tradition, I mean, one of the things that we do a lot in traditional Judaism is offer people blessings. We're always doing that. So I do, like, I want to offer, you know, to people the communal support and ancestral support they need to dive in and interpret and relate in an intimate way to their spiritual experiences and sacred texts and stories in their lineage. It is a really exciting process. It's one that's really healed and empowered me and also connected me. So I'm really excited. I just want to offer that energy to people going forward that participated today.
Yeah. And Robin's asking, what do you do with the fear of the stigma you may experience from others?
Oh, that is so real. Because unfortunately, yeah, we do live in a world where we're not fully liberated and we're not fully accepting. You know, for me, it's like, it's less about what I do with the fear and more about how do we shift things in the wider world. If you listen to the podcast that I did with Will Hall recently, you probably heard me talking about how in Torah or what some call the Old Testament, there's this phrase repeated over and over that we should welcome the stranger, that we should embrace and seek to understand those who are different than us. That is repeated over and over and over in our sacred traditions. So sometimes what I've done, like at synagogues or other spaces when I'm speaking, is remind people of that. To say, you know, there may be people here that have a different reality than you, have different resources, that pray different or have a different skin color, but our tradition, you know, the expectation is that we welcome into our holy community. So sometimes remembering that, you know, our tradition has your back. You know, a lot of the people in our ancestral maps, like if you look at the story of Miriam in the desert, like Miriam totally experienced rejection from her community, yet she's looked at as one of the most holy women prophets in Judaism. You know, we talked about how Abraham heard voices. Moses was terrified to speak in public, yet, you know, was asked to like do this important liberation of the Hebrew slaves. So our ancestors are not perfect. Many of them were looked at as strange, but they're also holy. So reminding people of that, I think, can be important. And the work I do, like in synagogues and with like people in spiritual communities, it's not teaching them something new, it's reminding them of the values.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is such highly charged stuff, but you know, and you spoke earlier about, like, I think just like somebody can go to a hearing voices group and maybe hear a subculture of people willing to take their experience as it is, but maybe also within a spiritual group, there might be a smaller group that can hear certain things.
Yeah.
Where the wider group can't yet do it. But culture change is so important. Mm-hmm. And so Penny's kind of like, I guess, maybe looking for more clues about how to help people shift from taking things literally to being open to looking at different kinds of interpretations. I think that is so key to a lot of this work, you know, that people are getting in trouble taking things totally literally. And
for me, what I found to be helpful is to come from a place of asking questions. So certainly the ancestral maps and exploring those can be useful. But like when I'm supporting someone, like I was supporting someone recently that her voices were telling her that she was desecrated. You're desecrated. You've been desecrated. And so what I think was helpful, you know, more so than me just kind of talking at her, was asking, like, so what does it mean to you to be desecrated? What does it mean to you to be consecrated? What does it mean? How do we reconsecrate things? Because a lot of our traditions, like the whole holiday of Hanukkah, for example, is about reconsecrating reconsecrating a space. So all of our traditions have this idea of, you know, we can make something that was not holy or whole again. But exploring with the person these meanings and concepts through kind of just curiosity is one thing that I've found to be useful, because when we're curious, it helps expand. When we take things literally, we're like, we get really locked in and really narrow. But sometimes by asking questions, we can start to expand our world and expand the concept.
Yeah, good point. Mary's wondering if you feel that all or most, or maybe just some people with, quote, mental illness could benefit from a spiritual interpretation of their experience?
You know, I'm not necessarily here to say like who needs what, but I do think that anyone, like I'm putting back the slide here, that anyone can benefit. Actually, our whole society benefits from people asking themselves questions about what is my purpose? What does life mean? Where do I come from? What is the nature of life? And what are some of the tools that people have used before me to connect, you know, with their ancestors or the holy? So ultimately, I think we are all, if we choose to identify it, we should all have access to our spiritual side. So what I don't think should happen, and what I've seen happen in hospitals, is that people be denied things like prayer rugs or access to an elder in their tradition. I think anyone, regardless of their diagnosis, that is yearning for these things, that we really need to make sure that they can have access.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I know in the mental health system, it's like when somebody obviously is having some kind of trouble, then if they do talk about spiritual stuff, that's just interpreted as like part of their illness, or even something we need to stop them from doing because it's part of the illness, as opposed to, hey, maybe there is some confusion there, but if we do get in and ask some questions and have a dialogue and discussion and expand it, well, maybe things will work out and the person will find.
Yeah. I mean, a system that purports to heal human beings needs to honor that, you know, each human being does have a spiritual inheritance and shouldn't be cut off from it, that's probably going to backfire in the end. So what I hope people have taken from the webinar is you don't have to believe in someone else's God, or, you know, experience what they're experiencing to be supportive. You know, a lot of these questions around navigating chosenness and initiation, you know, asking what is your role, trying to understand the role, who's supporting you, how are we sustaining this role? None of these types of questions and explorations require you to say, yes, I believe that you are the second coming of the Messiah. You know, we can hold, you know, these multiple realities, and must do so if we truly expect to create healing environments.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that maybe is a great conclusion, and I think we can leave the chat open for a bit if people want to stay on and exchange.
I'm facilitating this Alternatives to Suicide group in the next town over, so I should probably head out soon. If you want to learn about Alternatives to Suicide groups, you can Google them. I encourage people to do that. They're really powerful spaces where we've often talked about spirituality too. And here's my email so that you can get in touch with me if, you know, if there is something that you were curious about.
That's great. Thanks so much for this really inspiring talk. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
Bye.